In the autumn of 1843, during a routine drainage excavation along the edge of a modest canal project in southern Ohio, workers struck something that was not supposed to be there. Not rock, not root, not the scattered remnants of indigenous settlement that surveyors had been trained to log and move past. Something else entirely. Something that took 3 men to lift, that left a perfect circular impression in the clay below it, and that caused the project's lead engineer, a measured religious man who kept meticulous field journals, to stop writing. Completely, for 11 days, a wheel calendar mechanism that by every material analysis conducted in the century and a half since should not exist. Not here, not then, not ever. Not built from the materials it was built from, not arranged in the configuration it was arranged in, and, most critically, not pointing, with the mechanical precision of a Swiss instrument, to a date it had no earthly business knowing. The year 2030. The drainage project was unremarkable by every measure. 41 labourers, 3 supervisors, a contracted surveyor whose name appears in county records exactly twice and then vanishes. The object they pulled from the clay that October morning was approximately 4 feet in diameter, circular, divided into concentric rings, each etched with markings that, and this is where I need you to stay with me, bore no resemblance to any known indigenous writing system of the region, or any other region, at least not at first glance. At second glance, things get considerably stranger. And it is at that second glance where this story truly begins. The deeper I looked, the more the object refused to be categorized. That refusal, I came to understand, was not incidental. It was the first thing you needed to sit with. Surviving field sketches and a couple of low-quality photographs, and I say surviving deliberately, because the majority did not, show a mechanism of layered discs. Not a single carved stone, not a petroglyph, a mechanism. The outer ring appears to track something astronomical. The inner rings subdivide that cycle with a precision that a practicing astronomer, when shown reproductions of the sketches in the 1970s, described as either a remarkable coincidence or evidence of systematic observation spanning generations. He published nothing. His correspondence on the subject exists in a private collection that has changed hands 3 times since his death and is not currently accessible to researchers. Here's the strangest part. The innermost ring, the smallest, the most finely worked, terminates. It doesn't loop. It doesn't repeat. It ends at a fixed point. And when researchers in the late 20th century attempted to correlate that terminus with a solar or lunar calendar, working backward from the stratigraphy of the dig site to estimate the object's age, they arrived, through 2 independent methods, at the same date. Not a range. A date. The kind of specificity that stops serious people in their tracks, somewhere in the early years of the 4th decade of the 21st century. The calculations differ slightly, but neither calculation extends past 2030. I'm not going to tell you what that means. I'm going to ask you what it means that we're not allowed to discuss it openly. And I think that question deserves to be held carefully before we move any further. And I think this is where the real question lives, not the question of who made the object or how or why it ended up in an Ohio drainage trench. Those are fascinating questions. They may have answers, eventually. The deeper I went into this story, the more I came to believe that the object itself was almost secondary. The terminus is the message. Every calendar I have ever studied, every cyclical timekeeping system from every culture that has produced one, is built around repetition. The cycle completes and begins again. The wheel turns. That is the point of a wheel. It does not stop. It cannot stop. A wheel that stops is not a calendar. It is a countdown. And the question I cannot answer, the question that has kept me in this story longer than is probably reasonable, is whether the people who made this object believed they were recording a prediction or a memory. That distinction, small as it might seem, changes everything about how we are meant to receive it, because those are not the same thing. A prediction says, something is coming. A memory says, we have been here before. What does it mean that the innermost ring ends? What does it mean that it ends specifically within a margin of a few years at the present moment? What does it mean that the object was found, documented, partially, suppressed thoroughly, photographed accidentally, and then lost, and that at every stage of that process the people involved seem to have understood without being told that they should not pursue it further? Each of these questions compounds the last, and none of them can be answered in isolation. There is something that gets lost when we reduce an excavation to its findings. We focus on the object pulled from the ground and forget the ground itself. But the ground remembers. It holds things in ways that documents and institutions simply do not. The clay layer in which the wheel was found was, by the worker accounts we have, unusually undisturbed, compacted in a way that suggested it had not been opened in a very long time. One account describes the soil above it as stratified, visibly layered, the way sediment layers when it is left completely alone across centuries. Not decades, centuries. Which raises a question the original surveyors never formally asked. How old was the impression the object left behind? How long had it been sitting there perfectly still in the dark, waiting for someone to break the surface? That is not a rhetorical question. It is a geological one, and no one has ever seriously attempted to answer it. The drainage project moved on. The canal was completed. The ground was closed again. And whatever the earth had been trying to show us went back beneath it. The engineer's journal resumes after 11 days with a single entry. Not a description of the object, not measurements, not the excitement you would expect from a man who had just pulled something extraordinary out of the American earth. Instead, a note about weather, about the condition of the canal bank, about a shipment of timber that had arrived late. The mundanity of it is, itself, a kind of evidence. The object is not mentioned again, not once, in any surviving document connected to that project. Not in the engineer's journal, not in the contractor's ledger, not in the county surveyor's quarterly report, which covers the months in question in painstaking detail, every drainage test, every soil sample, every delay, except for a 4-page gap. 4 pages, exactly the span of the 11 days he stopped writing. That correspondence is not coincidental. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. A county newspaper from November of that year carries a brief notice, 2 sentences, about an unusual geological formation discovered near the canal works. The following week's edition carries a correction. The formation, the correction reads, had been reassessed by competent authority and found to be of natural origin. No name attached to that authority, no explanation of what natural process produces a 4-foot disc of worked stone divided into mathematically precise concentric rings. The correction answers nothing. It simply closes the door. The official explanation collapses here, quietly, with almost no sound at all. There are photographs, or rather there were. Most of them anyway. What remains is less a record than a suggestion of one. A handful survive. Fragments, really. Enough to confirm that someone at some point thought the object worth documenting. You can see the suggestion of a circular form in one, the edge of concentric markings in another. Nothing clean, nothing unambiguous, just enough to make you want more, and to make the absence of everything else feel like an answer in itself. Because the majority are gone. Described in letters, referenced in the margins of academic correspondence, mentioned once in a regional antiquarian publication as depicting an artifact of uncertain provenance recovered from the canal works, and then nowhere. No archive, no collection, no record of where they went or who last held them. The trail ends not with destruction, but with silence, which is somehow worse. What we have is the shadow of a larger record, the suggestion of it. People who saw something, wrote about having seen something, and then stopped. Not retracted, not denied, simply never mentioned again. The deeper I went, the more I came to understand that the absence tells you almost as much as what remains. Someone decided most of these images did not need to be preserved, or someone decided they needed to be preserved very carefully, somewhere casual inquiry would not reach. Either way, the result is the same, a circular object described consistently across decades, documented partially, and then swallowed by silence. Once you see that pattern, you can't unsee it. Why do the descriptions persist while the documentation vanishes? Why do a few fragments survive while the rest disappear so cleanly? And why, in every case, does the trail end not with a denial but with a quiet so complete it feels almost deliberate? These are not questions I expect to answer. They are questions I think we are obligated to keep asking. The silence was deafening. No one has ever produced a satisfying translation of the symbols etched into the outer rings. That is not for lack of trying. Reproductions of the surviving sketches have been shown quietly and informally to linguists, to epigraphers, to specialists in pre-Columbian sign systems. The responses are consistent in one specific way. Everyone agrees the markings are systematic, internally coherent, governed by rules. There is a grammar to them even if no one has unlocked it. That consensus alone, arrived at independently across disciplines, is remarkable. What they cannot agree on is the origin. Comparisons have been drawn to symbol sets from across the ancient world, and each comparison holds just enough to be tantalizing and breaks down just enough to be inconclusive. As if the markings belong to a tradition that influenced others, or was influenced by all of them, or predates the distinctions we use to separate them. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. The closer you look, the less it fits any single box, and the less it fits, the more significant that becomes. It is the kind of significance that serious scholars tend to set quietly aside. Let me set aside the calendar question for a moment. Let me just talk about the object as an object, because even stripped of its implications, it is extraordinary. The stone appeared to be not local to southern Ohio. The mineral composition suggests origin points that range from the upper Great Lakes to, in the most conservative reading, somewhere significantly further. The working of the surface is, by any honest assessment, extraordinarily fine. The tolerances between the concentric rings, the gaps where they can be measured from surviving sketches and photographs, are consistent across the disc to a degree that suggests either tools we have not accounted for or a process of refinement so patient and so systematic that it reframes everything we think we know about pre-contact craft in the region. Not improvised, not ceremonial in the rough-hewn sense we typically assign to ancient objects when we want to stop asking questions. Precise, calibrated, intentional in a way that implies not just a maker, but a system, a tradition, a body of knowledge being applied, not invented. That distinction between invention and application is one worth pausing on. And here's where the technology question becomes impossible to ignore. The calendar function, if that is what it is, requires an understanding of astronomical cycles that takes generations to accumulate. You do not calculate the precession of the equinoxes in a single lifetime. You do not build a terminus point, a specific non-repeating endpoint, without a theoretical framework sophisticated enough to conceive of endings in the first place. This raises a simple but critical question. Who taught them to think about time as something that could run out? And what did they believe was waiting at the end of it? Here is what the record, fragmentary as it is, suggests happened next. And the fragmentation itself is part of the story. Sometime in the winter of 1843 or the very early months of 1844, the object was moved, not to a university, not to a government survey office, not documented, not studied, not placed in the emerging tradition of American antiquarianism that was, at that very moment, producing significant public interest in Ohio's earthworks. It was moved quietly, privately, to where we cannot say with certainty. But the clay impression it left behind, described in one surviving worker's account, written decades later as part of a broader reminiscence about canal labour, was deliberately filled. The worker recalled being instructed to pack the impression with fresh clay brought from another part of the site, to make the ground look undisturbed. He recalled being told that the object had been sent to proper hands. He recalled that no one asked questions. The ease of that silence decades later still strikes me as significant, as if they were following instructions they didn't fully understand. The evidence suggests something much larger than one object, one site, one moment of bureaucratic inconvenience. The pattern of suppression, missing journal pages, the corrected newspaper notice, the misfiled photographs, the unpublished analysis, this pattern does not emerge from a single decision. It is too distributed, too consistent across too many years and too many different actors who could not have coordinated their silence unless that silence was, somehow, the expected response. Not conspiracy exactly, something older than conspiracy, a habit, one that appears to have been rehearsed long before 1843. What keeps this from being a single strange story is the corroboration, not of the object itself, corroboration of the response to it. And that distinction matters more than it might initially seem. Across the decades following 1843, scattered references surface in sources that have no apparent connection to each other. A passing mention in a private letter, a footnote withdrawn from a published monograph before final printing, visible only because an earlier draft survived in a university collection. A brief notice, then a retraction, each instant small, each one taken alone, easily dismissed. But taken together? The evidence suggests something much larger than one buried object and one embarrassed engineering project. It suggests a pattern of recognition, people encountering this story, grasping its implications and then stepping back from it. Not debunking it, not investigating it fully, simply setting it down and walking away, as if they understood instinctively that some doors once opened could not be closed again on comfortable terms. That instinct, repeated, reliable, almost reflexive, is worth naming for what it is. That instinct, repeated across generations, is its own kind of data. And I find I cannot stop thinking about what it means. I cannot tell you where the object is now. I can tell you that certain archival requests I made in the course of this investigation were denied on grounds that were charitably unusual. I can tell you that one institution acknowledged the existence of a relevant file, and then, in a follow-up communication, stated that no such file had been located. Once you see the shape of this, you can't unsee it. Not one mystery. Not a single eccentric discovery that slipped through the cracks of history. A pattern, the same response, across 180 years applied to the same object. Find, record partially, suppress quietly, move, and then silence. As if the silence were the final ring of the mechanism, as if the silence were itself part of the design. And if that is true, then the silence is not an ending. It is an instruction. Who built something designed to be found and then hidden? Who calibrated a calendar to end not at a round number, not at a mythological moment, but at this particular window of years, our years, the years we are living through right now? What did they know that we are only beginning to suspect? And the question I return to, every time, the one that keeps the whole thing open and unresolved and impossible to simply file and move past. Why does the wheel stop? Not where does it stop? Not when. Not under which rock or in which archive or in which private collection it currently sits. Waiting. Why? A wheel that is built to stop is not a wheel. It is a message. And every message, no matter how old, no matter how deeply buried, is addressed to someone. I am beginning to think it might be addressed to us.